Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, I thought that I would review this little video because I found it very, very interesting. I've noticed that the past several videos that I've done on this channel, because my channel is mainly about boxing, but I do talk about other sports as well. But the main fighter that I've been talking about lately has been Canelo Alvarez. And the reason why that is, though, is because I like a certain amount of conversations, once again, about greatness. So, depending on what sport it is, if it comes to tennis, which is a sport that I tend to love to watch as well, I'll tend to talk about Novak Djokovic or Rafael Nadal or Roger Federer or Daniel Medvedev, who, in my opinion, seems to be the best young player out of the bunch, but we'll see what happens with that. If I'm talking about football, of course, I like to talk about Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, Russell Wilson, and there's a couple of other very great up-and-comers as well. I just can't put them on the elite tier quite as of yet. Maybe those guys like a Lamar Jackson, a Josh Allen, a couple of others that I may be forgetting. Deshaun Watson if he goes to the right team. And, of course, now the new and improved quarterback, Kyler Murray. So, and there's a couple of others that maybe I'm forgetting. Justin Herbert as well. So we'll see where those guys go when it comes down to it. But it'll be very, very interesting. But anyways, I always like to talk about elite level talent. And when it comes to elite level talent, when it comes to the most amount of narratives, there's always the most amount of narratives about the guys that usually are at the top. If you watch NBA basketball, for example, the most amount of narratives that come out about certain basketball players, it isn't usually going to be about Damian Lillard or Luka Doncic or something like that. Don't get me wrong, there may be certain, rumors through the grapevine here and there about them, but who are the people that you usually hear the most about, whether it be bad rumors or good rumors? LeBron James, Kawhi Leonard, Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, Giannis Antetokounmpo. Because everyone knows pretty much universally that those guys are pretty much at the top. When you hear rumors about boxing, or when you hear overall narratives or debates about boxing, usually it's going to come down to a few people. You're going to hear Canelo Alvarez in those conversations. You're going to hear Tyson Fury in those conversations. You're going to hear Anthony Joshua, Alexander Usyk in those conversations. Now, Anthony Joshua, even though I do think he is a very high-level fighter, he is also very popular. Of course, I don't think he any longer would be on my top 10 pound-for-pound list, of course, because of his recent loss, but he still is a very decent fighter. Terrence Crawford, Earl Spence, they're going to be up there as well. Gervonta Tank Davis is on his way. Basically, certain fighters that people know are already on another level, or they think all in all that they're going to be on a whole nother level. And that's why Canelo Alvarez, he pretty much is making things run in boxing right now. He pretty much owns this corner. He pretty much owns this street, this sport called boxing. Right now, I believe that his pay-per-view buys did something around 800,000 buys against Caleb Plant. Now, once again, I believe that Caleb Plant was a great fighter when it comes down to it. But all in all, I'm very surprised that it even did those numbers because Caleb Plant, even though he's a very decent fighter, Caleb Plant is not necessarily a fighter that I expected to do 800,000 pay-per-view buys. That tells me that if Canelo Alvarez, if he were to have a fight against David Benavidez or Jamal Charlo next, there's a very possible chance that that fight may do over 1 million pay-per-view buys. Now, I don't personally think that David Benavidez or Jamal Charlo are in a completely different league compared to Caleb Plant, but what I do believe is this. I do believe that they have more notoriety, and I do believe all in all that they have more popularity. That's what I personally believe. And that's why I say that I believe that Canelo Alvarez, more than likely, is probably going to go after Jamal Charlo next. He may go after David Benavidez after that, but who knows? We'll see. That's why I believe that the Demetrius Andrade fight, that's probably the least likely one to happen because I think Canelo, I think he looks at Andrade and he says, he is a very decent boxer, but he's just a little bit too much trouble for, in my opinion, what it's worth. So I think the chances of him facing a David Benavidez or a Jamal Charlo is very much more likely. Unfortunately for Demetrius Andrade, in my opinion, I'm not sure how old he is. I'm not sure if he's older or younger than Canelo. But Demetrius Andrade, if he wants to get that Canelo Alvarez fight, he's going to have to get it the hard way. Because Demetrius Andrade, he has a type of style almost like the Cubans type of style. Now, in my opinion, I've already said this in the past, I don't think Andrade is even as talented as a Primera Sonny Lara. That's my personal opinion. To be honest, I don't know if there's a lot of defensive fighters that Canelo has fought that, in my opinion, are on the same level as a Primera Sonny Lara. Because Lara really is a defensive wizard. Some of these Cuban fighters, very, very tough fighters to face. But when it comes down to it, all in all, I think that Demetrius Andrade, he could provide Canelo Alvarez with a challenge, but he's going to have to get in the ring with some of those A-grade fighters. He's going to have to corner them. That means that you're going to have to try to get David Benavidez. That means maybe you're going to have to try to get Caleb Plant, possibly Jamal Charlo. But I don't know how many people are really going to push for a Demetrius Andrade fight. All in all, really when Demetrius Andrade continues fighting these guys, that's not me saying that maybe Andrade would not deserve a fight over some guys. But what I'm saying is this: each and every boxer realizes that, this guy, when it comes down to it, he's just a little bit too much trouble for too little reward, in my opinion. Araceli Lara was a very similar fighter. Guillermo Rigondeaux was a very similar fighter. So it is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to it, this video, we're going to be talking about Canelo Alvarez and his physical peak. And of course, this is Fannon International Boxing. I tend to disagree with him on some subjects, but, I would say that I don't disagree with him as much as, say, Dante's Boxing Nation or some of those other channels. So it is what it is. But anyways, Fannon actually is going to state something very interesting. He's going to restate something that David Benavidez Sr. said. Apparently, he said that he believes that Canelo Alvarez, that his body could be breaking down, which I think is very, very interesting. Anyways, we're going to talk about it. Let's get into it.
All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. In this video, we're going to talk about something that Jose Benavidez, the father of David Benavidez, had to say about Canelo Alvarez, and the fact that Canelo Alvarez looks like he's wearing down and will be very, very beatable soon by guys that you may not think have a chance to beat him. I'm also going to, in this video, show you examples through boxing history where that is the case. So don't shoot the messenger. Watch the video to the end. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. Canelo Alvarez is almost universally recognized as the #1 fighter in boxing right now. He is most certainly the #1 big money fighter in boxing right now. Many people believe that he's the best fighter in boxing right now.
He is. I don't really see an argument out there. Like I said, so many people, especially these LDBC channels, they want to say, oh, well, Canelo, he's ducking high-class competition. But let's be real, I don't know if there's another boxer out there that I can claim has more A-class fights on their resume than what a Canelo Alvarez has. Not Errol Spence Jr., certainly not a Terrence Bud Crawford, not Vasyl Lomachenko, not, I'm trying to think, not Alexander Usyk, not Tyson Fury, not Josh Taylor, none of those guys. All the guys that may be on my top 10 pound for pound list, Naoya Inoue, I don't think Naoya Inoue has even fought one A-grade fighter. So it is what it is. My point being is this, it's just, unless Canelo were to lose or maybe have a draw, or let's say Terrence Crawford, for example, if he were to become my #1 pound for pound fighter, or Errol Spence Jr. potentially, let's say there would be a super fight between Terrence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., I would say that it certainly would be arguable whoever would be the winner of that fight could be the #1 pound for pound fighter. Probably more likely Terrence Bud Crawford, just because he's had so much work throughout, a few weight divisions. Errol Spence has only done it within one. So if he became completely unified, he basically would be like the Marvin Hagler of this era, where all in all, he would be clearly the best of one weight division, but he only kind of has done one, work within one weight division. At least I believe Marvin Hagler only really did work within one weight division, but if I'm wrong, someone correct me.
And that he is absolutely undefeatable. That's what
Well, I'm not going to say that Canelo Alvarez, all in all, is undefeatable. What I will say is that no fighter, in my opinion, is, undefeatable, or no fighter, all in all, is invincible. No one is invincible at the end of the day. So you always have to be careful when it comes down to it. Canelo has to be careful. He has to be very disciplined. But I believe that Canelo Alvarez, I believe that he's the most disciplined that he ever has been. That's not me saying, all in all, that he never was. All I'm saying is that Canelo Alvarez, he's at that point now, I believe, in his career to where he is at his absolute peak. And I don't think that he's going to let anyone take the throne from him, at least as of right now. When Canelo Alvarez loses, if he even loses again in his career, I think it'll be a little bit later on, maybe when he was about 35, 36 years of age. But for the next 3 to 4 years, I believe that this sport is going to be completely ruled over by Canelo Alvarez.
Been hearing ever since he beat Caleb Plant in the last fight, and maybe a little bit before that. Jose Benavidez, though, who was the father of David Benavidez, the former WBC 168-pound champion, actually shared some information and gave his viewpoint, and I thought it was I thought that it was an excellent point and something that bears out from what I have noticed and what I've seen throughout my time watching boxing, which is essentially that all good things come to an end. And, Canelo Alvarez is at a point in his career typically where guys start going downhill. Now, where is Canelo Alvarez?
I would be interested to hear your cases now. Fannon, or whatever he calls himself, he says all in all that, he's going to provide some cases, some examples. Canelo Alvarez, I believe, as of right now, in 2021, I believe that he is 31 years of age. And, of course, he has a lot of fights in his resume, but there's been fighters in the past, I don't know, that have had a lot of fights on their resume as well. And I think Canelo, I think that he's paced himself decently well. Who knows, I could be wrong. There are certain fighters that maybe have broken down around his age. But, at least within the time that I've been watching boxing, I've never seen a fighter that has been at their absolute peak at 31 years of age and they just automatically broke down, especially in this time. Because this is basically the time of a bunch of performance enhancers and a bunch of certain hormones that maybe were not around, back then. That's why I believe you see certain fighters now even lasting all the way into their 40s. Don't get me wrong, there's certain fighters all in all like Bernard Hopkins or George Foreman even in the older days that somewhat lasted into their 40s, but I'm talking about certain fighters like a Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather Jr. Fighters that are like literally winning almost A-plus fights. Because Bernard Hopkins, when he was in his 40s, really Bernard Hopkins throughout his whole entire career, he beat Felix Tito Trinidad. I give him a lot of credit for that win. But besides that, there's not a whole lot of wins that I would take a look at his record and say, oh my God, that dude was really all-time great. But let me give Bernard Hopkins respect. Let me give him credit because, of course, he did defeat a certain amount of great fighters. He defeated Jean Pascal. He defeated overall Kelly Pavlik. He defeated Felix Tito Trinidad and Oscar De La Hoya. So I give him credit, but once again, like I've always said with Bernard Hopkins, in my opinion, Bernard Hopkins has easily been the most overrated boxer in boxing history. Because he would be within my top 30, top 40, but he really does not belong within that top 20 to top 10 range. Because when you talk about fighters that are within the top 10 and top 20 range, those are fighters all in all that, in my opinion, were either definitively the best of their weight division when they had A-grade competition, or fighters all in all that at one point in time could have been debated as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And I'm sorry, but I just don't think that there's any point in time in boxing history where Bernard Hopkins would have been ranked as the all-around number one pound-for-pound fighter.
In his career, he is a guy I do believe he's got somewhere around 60 fights. He's been fighting as a professional for over 15 years. He has been in a bunch of different championship fights, and on top of it, he's somebody that is very dedicated to the game and trains on an ongoing basis, right? Pretty much as soon as he gets done training, gets done fighting, may take a little bit of time, but he's back in training camp, and over time, and this is what Jose Benavidez said, over time, your body stops reacting the way it used to, and your fight age is going to start showing. Now, that's what he's saying when he is.
Well, I agree with that to a certain degree, but I wonder what makes Benavidez Sr. kind of say that. It's no offense overall, to them. I do believe all in all that they want the fight, but I kind of have to take this a little bit as clout chasing. That's what I personally believe. I think all in all that he's doing this basically to try to, hype the fight up. Kind of like what Teofimo Lopez's father does for him, or what Danny Garcia's father used to do for him. He's basically the great motivator, the great, hype artist. That's what I believe that he is. Because I'm sorry, but once again, through my days, at least of watching boxing, I've never seen a fighter that was debatably the number one pound-for-pound fighter that at 31 years old, unless they suffered a traumatic injury, that all of a sudden they just dropped off the cliff. I've never seen it. I've seen certain fighters all in all never be the same after they suffered a brutal knockout, but that's a different story.
Putting up the argument that David Benavidez, and I would say also guys like Jamal Charlo and other people around that weight class will have Canelo Alvarez will be vulnerable to those guys. If he is not vulnerable right now, he will be vulnerable very, very soon. Now, one of the observations that Jose Benavidez made is something that I noticed in the fight against Caleb's Plant, but that when you say it, a whole lot of people jump on your chest when you say it. But I was like, look, man, Canelo Alvarez, you know, Caleb Plant put up a good fight with Canelo Alvarez for several rounds. Eventually, the body shots and the experience and all.
Now, Fannon or Fannon, he basically just said that, well, a whole bunch of people jump on your chest. And I could tell all in all that at the beginning of the video, there's been a certain amount of Canelo Alvarez fans that have probably came on his channel and got after him for some of the stuff that he has said. But I don't necessarily mind you saying that maybe Canelo Alvarez, that he's breaking down if you can somewhat prove it. But to me, that's a little bit of an outlandish statement because I don't think I've seen any personal evidence that Canelo Alvarez is breaking down. And once again, he's 31 years old. Maybe if he was 33 going on 34 or 34 going on 35, I would kind of understand. But once again, I've never seen an all-time great boxer, and Canelo is an all-time great boxer. I've never seen an all-time great boxer through my days that at 31 years of age, when it comes down to it, just automatically starts breaking down. Or, just kind of out of nowhere at around that age. I've never seen it.
All that.
At least not during these times.
And the talent level of Canelo Alvarez took over, and he wound up stopping Caleb Plant. But early on in the fight, Caleb Plant was having success against Canelo Alvarez, right? Now, the thing...
Well, that's true, but Caleb Plant also is a very good fighter. So if you're basing your case all in all just because Caleb Plant had some sort of success, I don't think that that's really enough to quantify that Canelo, that his body's breaking down on him, and that all in all, he's going to soon lose to one of these guys because he's not going to be physically the same. I mean, I'm sorry, but I have to call it just like, some other people would call it. I kind of have to say that, that's a little bit of cap. But it is what it is.
It brings this to mind for me is what, another guy that used to be the best fighter in boxing. Nobody thought that he could lose. He was doing amazing things. He was definitely the pound for pound, number one pound for pound fighter in boxing. He had everything going for him except for the fact that, he wasn't the biggest money maker necessarily in boxing.
If I had to guess who he's going to say, he's probably going to say Vasyl Lomachenko. But Vasyl Lomachenko, in my opinion, he's not really physically breaking down, but he is susceptible to injuries. But I think that's a little bit of a different situation because Vasyl Lomachenko, he has a very, very big amateur background. So when you talk about certain fighters like that, like a Guillermo Rigondeaux or a Vasyl Lomachenko or one of these other, Cuban fighters possibly, or Ukrainian fighters, ones that have a very, very extensive history and expansive history in the amateurs. Even though it's not as harsh as professional boxing, of course, because it's more point-based, it still can be toll on the body. So I think we have to take a look at someone like that a little bit differently. Now, Canelo, of course, has been fighting for a very long time. But, I just don't see any signs of Canelo Alvarez right now, at least in my opinion, really shutting down. I just don't see it. If you're talking about certain fighters that I believe are shutting down, if there's any examples right now, like, Kell Brook, I think that he was pretty much done after the Errol Spence fight. I don't think he was ever the same even after the Gennady Golovkin fight. But after that Errol Spence fight, he was pretty much mincemeat. I mean, he was pretty much, he came straight from a meat shredder out of that fight. It is what it is. He was done. So it is what it is. But, I can't think of any other fighter right now that I just say, oh, wow, I think they're breaking down. I just don't see it.
And that is Roy Jones Jr. If you had looked at Roy Jones...
Roy Jones Jr. actually is not a bad example. But by the time Roy Jones Jr., all in all, by the time that he broke down, I believe all in all that he was about 34 years old. Now, if I'm wrong about that, then someone correct me. But I believe by the time all in all that he ended up getting knocked out by Antonio Tarver, I believe all in all that was because, first of all, he moved back down in weight, which was, in my opinion, not a good thing for him to do, but it is what it is. When it comes down to it, sometimes you don't want to do that because it drains you, and sometimes you're never the same fighter ever again. But Roy was also a person, let's be real, that is not necessarily the same defensive responsible fighter that a Canelo Alvarez is, at least in my opinion. It is what it is, but anyway.
Junior career when he was at 154 for a little bit of time. He moved up to 160 pounds, beat Bernard Hopkins at 160 pounds. I do believe he beat James Toney at 168 pounds. He was beating everybody in boxing, everybody that he fought in boxing, by leaps and bounds. Just destroying the guys. He was so dominant that he would actually, do these gimmicks.
I'm going to say this, though. Roy Jones Jr. is one of those guys that he's almost kind of like an Odell Beckham Jr., if I want to say that. And some people are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? If you know football, if you know all in all who Odell Beckham Jr. was, or still is because he still plays in the league, Odell Beckham Jr. is someone that is so physically gifted in his prime. He has excellent speed. He has decent strength, great route running, and his hands are very, very large. So that means all in all that, even with gloves, sure, you can kind of mention that if you want to. But having very large hands as a wide receiver in football, that's going to give you some major, advantages when it comes down to it. Jerry Rice was another wide receiver, I believe, that had very big hands as well. So that kind of helped him out as well. But, or I won't say that he's like the Odell Beckham Jr., but he's kind of like the Randy Moss. Randy Moss, I guess, maybe I don't want to compare him completely to that, but my point being is this. Roy Jones Jr. relied so much on his athleticism that once that athleticism went out the window, he was never the same fighter ever again. That's why Roy Jones Jr., that's why certain people don't want to compare him to like a Bernard Hopkins or a Floyd Mayweather Jr. But in my opinion, Bernard, yeah, people can argue kind of like, he did better in the latter half of his career, but he still was never on that peak of Roy Jones Jr., not even close. Like Bernard Hopkins at his absolute best, he was never even in the same league as a Roy Jones Jr. Where if we were talking about Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather Jr. or someone else, yeah, you can say that they're somewhat close, but Bernard Hopkins, no, you can't say that. It is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to it, Roy Jones Jr., once again, he was a person to where I've always said this about Roy. He is debatably the most talented athlete that I've personally ever seen. Certainly in boxing history. He probably is the most talented athlete that I've ever seen in boxing history. But when you talk about even greatest athlete of all time, or at least of the past, let's say 100 to 120 plus years, he's probably, he is in that debate as the greatest athlete of all time. Like, he's up there all in all with, like, Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan and Muhammad Ali and whoever else you want to put there. If I'm missing any all-time great athletes when it comes down to, like, Roy is in that conversation.
He would go play basketball, tape himself playing a semi-pro basketball game before he had a fight that night. Pretty much just showing how much better than he was than everybody around him. After that, he went all the way up to heavyweight, right? So this is a guy that was the best fighter from 154 pounds, goes all the way up to do something that nobody that I know of that has been that small, except for maybe Sam Langford in the early 1900s, was able to do, which is go out there and beat a heavyweight. Now, he beat John Ruiz. John Ruiz was not, I don't think John Ruiz is the best heavyweight in the world, but John Ruiz had...
I agree as well.
Definitely had a belt. And Roy Jones Jr. beats him, right? Top of the world. And I remember it because I was there ringside. Well, I was not ringside. I was in the arena for the fight. And after the fight, during the press conference, Antonio Tarver is at the press conference, and he starts pressing Roy Jones Jr. for a fight. Everybody blew off Antonio Tarver, because Antonio Tarver was supposed to be a mandatory, but he had lost a fight. I can't remember the name of the guy who he lost the fight to, but he lost the fight, and so therefore he was no longer
I had a person all in all that I was debating with on this one boxing forum, and we were trying to debate who, in my opinion, was the greater fighter between the two, either Bernard Hopkins or Joe Calzaghe. Now, almost 90% of people would actually debate Bernard Hopkins over Joe Calzaghe. I personally would not. And the reason why that is because Bernard Hopkins was a person that lost a great amount of the big fights in his career. It is what it is. He did win some of the bigger ones. He won against Felix Tito Trinidad and beat Oscar De La Hoya. But let's be real. When you kind of fought people more your own size, like Chad Dawson and Joe Calzaghe and some of those other guys and Jermaine Taylor, there's a reason why Bernard Hopkins lost to those guys, because his skill set was good, but it was vastly overrated. Vastly overrated when it came down to it. Bernard was a great fighter, but he was somewhat limited in certain areas. That's why when you take a look at those fights, he lost every single one of those fights. Yeah, he can beat Felix Tito Trinidad and Oscar De La Hoya overall, who are heavily outsized, let's be real. But, when it comes to some of the other fighters that were similar in size, he usually would get outboxed almost every single time. And Bernard Hopkins, he basically gets this, cop out card because he was in his 40s. Bernard Hopkins was in his 40s when he was pretty much at the best point in his career. And some people all know, they're of course not going to agree with that. They're going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? How can you be at the best point in your career when you're in your 40s? Well, let me ask you something. Was Bernard Hopkins at the best point in time in his career when he was in his 20s? Was Bernard Hopkins ever looked at really as a top 10 pound for pound fighter during his 20s? I don't believe he was. By the time Bernard Hopkins was looked at as one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world, you know how old he was? He was about 36 or 37 years old. So it is what it is. He defended his middleweight titles that many times, all the way up until his 40s. Then he met a fighter that actually was complete in Jermaine Taylor or talented enough, and that's when he finally lost. It is what it is. And then later on, he would beat Antonio Tarver all in all, but then he could not beat Joe Calzaghe. When Joe Calzaghe beat Bernard Hopkins, first of all, I thought he clearly beat Bernard Hopkins. I thought it was a clear 8 rounds to 4. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, I thought all in all that Bernard Hopkins, he pretty much was at the best point in his career. Of course, that sounds ludicrous to say when someone is 40 something years old, but you must understand. Bernard Hopkins was the Ring Magazine champion at light heavyweight. Joe Calzaghe, he was a unified champion, I believe, at 168. He was a Ring Magazine champion there. Then he went up to light heavyweight, and all in all, I believe that he beat Bernard Hopkins. I thought that he beat him clearly. Of course, surprise, surprise, the only judge that scored it for Bernard Hopkins was Adelaide Bird, a person who never should be allowed to really score boxing in the first place because she never knows how to score a fight. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, Joe Calzaghe, he later on would be the first loss that the great fighter Mikhail Kessler would have in his career. The fighter, all in all, that would later on, beat Carl Froch, but then get defeated, against Carl Froch in the rematch, and then, of course, get beat by Andre Ward. So a lot of people, they really try to degrade Joe Calzaghe or not give him a lot of credit. Let's be real. The only reason why that is because he's a Caucasian fighter. And a lot of these Caucasian fighters, especially, they're not taken as seriously as some of these other guys. It's kind of like when we take a look at NBA basketball. A lot of people may take a look at Larry Bird and they're just like, Larry wasn't that good. Or they'll take a look at Jerry West or something like that and they'll say, well, they really weren't that good. Larry Bird overall was the debatable best player in the 80s. I would personally say that it was Magic Johnson, but all in all, you could debate that it was Larry Bird. Jerry West, in my opinion, was debatably greater than Oscar Robertson. A lot of people don't know. But they pretty much had the same accomplishments. The difference between Oscar Robertson and Jerry West is that Jerry West had 9 finals appearances. Oscar only had 2. All right? It is what it is. And Oscar was never able to win shit without Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Jerry West was never able to win shit without Wilt Chamberlain. So it is what it is. Bottom line is this. Joe Calzaghe, in my opinion, he was within that top 20 to top 30 range. A lot of people can disagree, but that's where he is, in my opinion. He's an undefeated fighter. He won all the big fights in his career, and he beat some very decent fighters. I'm not saying that, he has a list of 10 first ballot Hall of Famers on there, but when you take a look at Joe Calzaghe, yes, Joe Calzaghe was one of the best fighters of his day. He was an all-time great fighter, and in my opinion, you can debate him as the greatest British fighter of all time, which means that, in my opinion, you could even debate him possibly in the top 10 because that means that he would be right there with Lennox Lewis. In my opinion, when we talk about the greatest British fighter of all time, it's either Joe Calzaghe or Lennox Lewis.
Mandatory to fight Roy Jones Jr. And Roy Jones Jr. beat the guy that beat James Toney, goes up to heavyweight, wins a heavyweight title, and there Antonio Tarver is talking all kind of smack about what he's going to do, and everybody blew him off. Everybody was like, how could you talk? This is a mismatched fight. He moves all the way. This is Roy Jones Jr. He's one of the greatest fighters ever to fight, right? What happens when he fights Antonio Tarver? The first time, a lot of people think he lost the fight. In the second fight, Antonio Tarver knocks him out. Now, why would that happen to Roy Jones Jr.? Did he get that much less talented? Or was he never not what people said that he was? That's not my belief. I believe at a certain point in time, your body just says that's it. You get to operate. You can operate at a very, very high level for a certain amount of time.
Well, I agree with that, but Roy Jones Jr., let's also be real about Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr., if we want to talk about defensively, he's not as defensive as Canelo was. At least when you talk about now, Roy Jones Jr., in my opinion, of course, as of right now, would have to be counted as greater than Canelo Alvarez. But all in all, if you really want to talk about who is more defensively responsible, people all know they have no problem basically saying that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is more defensively responsible, or Bernard Hopkins was more defensively responsible than Roy Jones Jr. All that's well and good, but there's a bunch of fighters actually, if we want to talk about in boxing history, that were more defensively responsible in terms of keeping their hands up in a certain amount of other things than Roy Jones Jr. That's why he got knocked out against Antonio Tarver. It is what it is. Partially, I do believe all in all that his athleticism was going down, but there's a reason why certain fighters like Mayweather and even Pacquiao, when they're a little bit older with age, and Pacquiao, in my opinion, he's not necessarily someone that has an A grade defense or an A plus defense anyway, but he's someone all in all that can handle himself. There's a reason why Roy Jones Jr., I believe at about 34 years old, why all in all he was able to get handled the way that he was. It is what it is.
And just because you're beating all these people that people, and people don't give other people a chance does not mean that you're not going to hit that wall. And that's what Jose Benavidez is saying about Canelo relative to David Benavidez, and what I'm saying relative to several of those guys that are not several, a few of those guys that are around the same size as Canelo in Demetrius Andrade and Jamal Charlo. Canelo Alvarez can go to the top of the world, but at a certain point in time, man, your body is going to start slowing down. That's what I think I started seeing actually several fights ago with Canelo. What I think I saw
In which fight specifically?
Against Caleb Plant, and if he gets,
I think that Canelo Alvarez, like I said, Caleb Plant was naturally bigger than Canelo. At least when we talk about it in terms of height and reach, Caleb Plant was a very decently slick fighter. I expected Caleb Plant to give Canelo Alvarez at least a good 3 or 4 rounds. So I cannot necessarily agree with Fannon's point here. I cannot agree with his assessment because I don't think all in all that it's something that you can try to put the assessment out there, but when you just take a look at the logic and the facts, I just don't think that there's going to be a lot of that on your side. Sure, Canelo Alvarez, he lost a few rounds in that fight, but Caleb Plant's a very talented fighter. Now, maybe if it were against someone like, one of Charlo's or Andre's last opponents, then I'd be like, okay, maybe that's something for a little bit of concern. But Canelo, for the past, 4 years at least, he's been at his physical peak. Ever since that Miguel Cotto fight, all the way up until now, he's looked absolutely phenomenal.
In there in the ring with David Benavidez, a young 24-year-old guy, or even Jamal Charlo, a guy that is around the same age as him but does not have nearly as long a career as Canelo Alvarez, that age can catch up to you, man. And I'm telling you, people that act like, that want to talk about fights not being made because they know that this guy is going to win this fight, or that this guy is going to win that fight, man, that's not how it works, man. And it's definitely not how it works when you get up into your 15th, 16th, 17th year of professional fighting. Like, people talk about how much Canelo Alvarez, achieved when he was 24, how much he's achieved by the time he's, 30 years old, but they forget that he has been training professionally and having professional training camps since the guy was 15 years old. So, now I'm not going to tell you that
I think that all in all that might be your best point, but I don't know if I can necessarily say that Canelo Alvarez is breaking down as a fighter. I just don't know if I'm buying that. Floyd Mayweather Jr., all in all, I mean, I don't remember necessarily when he was in professional boxing, but Floyd Mayweather Jr. was fighting in boxing for like, I can't remember when. I know that he started in the 1990s. But of course, he retired, I believe, in like 2015. I believe it was 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. Last professional fight, at least against a real professional boxer, was against Andre Berto. But when it comes down to it, all in all, Floyd was able to fight till he was damn near 40. And it was the same thing with Manny Pacquiao. I mean, Manny Pacquiao was training professionally ever since he was like damn near 16 years old. So, I think it just depends on the fighter. But do I see personally, every fighter is different, but do I see personally Canelo Alvarez breaking down? No, I don't.
I know for sure that David Benavidez is going to be Canelo, or Jamal Charlo is going to be Canelo.
Now, if you're talking about a fighter, and this fighter is a bit older, If you're talking about a fighter that I believe is nowhere near the same that he was, especially after that Canelo Alvarez rematch, I have to say Gennady Golovkin. Gennady Golovkin, ever since after that rematch, he's pretty much been toast. you know.
Or Demetrius Andrade is going to beat Canelo. But I will tell you that I do believe that those guys have chances to beat Canelo Alvarez because they're all very, very good fighters. And at a certain point in time, man, Canelo Alvarez is going, that wear and tear that he has on his body is going to affect him to the degree where somebody who may not have necessarily the experience that he has or even the talent that he has is going to be able to beat him. So I wouldn't be so quick to brush off.
Well, maybe, but like I said, I need to see it happen firsthand. Like I said, Canelo Alvarez, all in all, he's at his absolute peak right now. He's 31 years old. He's as good defensively as he ever has been. His offense, his power, his speed, they all look there. His athleticism looks there. I see him basically completely run through three opponents this year, two of them being A grade in my opinion. So, I mean, I just I don't see it.
What Jose Benavidez has, or when Jamal Charlo says, "Man, this dude is getting tired." I think
Now, Vasyl Lomachenko is someone that, if we were to talk about him, that's someone all in all that may be able to tire out because just because of the way that he fights. Vasyl Lomachenko is very, very offensive, and on top of that, he's very prone to injuries. He's very, prone to shoulder injuries, especially whether it be the rotator cuff or something else when it comes down to it. And on top of that, because of how pressurized he is and how offensive he fights, and on top of that, he's not really someone that is super duper big for his division. That's someone all in all that, he may be out of the game by age 35. You never know. But Canelo, he's very defensively responsible. He has very good offense. When it comes down to it, he's an excellent counterpuncher. He's decently slick. He doesn't usually take a whole lot of damage within his fights. So I think Canelo's going to be in the sport for a while.
I can beat Canelo or Demetrius Andrade when he goes to a Canelo Alvarez press conference. As far as how much money these guys are bringing to the fights and bringing to the equation, hey, look, that is not going to change in any it's not going to change quickly. However, again, where people get that old, when they get to the peak of their career and they've been in boxing for 16, 17 years, just like what happened to Manny Pacquiao when he fought Yordenis Ugas. Just a couple years before that, maybe 2 years before that, they meant that might not have happened. But
Well, I agree with you, but how old was Manny Pacquiao when he finally lost to Yordenis Ugas? He was like, what, 43 years old? And he had a 2 year layoff. So I don't really know where this point is coming from where Canelo Alvarez's body is breaking down. But, I think you're trying hard to make it. But, do I think, Fannon is necessarily a hater of Canelo Alvarez? I don't know if he's a hater of him particularly, even though I have heard him all in all, try to put Crawford over him. Maybe that is the reason why. I don't know. But like I said, I'm sorry, I'm just not buying it. I'm not buying the, I think Canelo's, all worn, torn, and down. I'm not buying that.
he got there. And I'm telling you, it's not just the chronological age, just like how many years you've been alive, but how much wear and tear you've had on your body. And Canelo has been fighting at a very high level from a very young age and training consistently and all that. And hey, man, it's not just very likely that it'll happen. It definitely will happen. And that's why, people talk about why.
Well, I think all in all, Canelo, he may lose a couple more fights in his career, but, if that more than likely happens, in my opinion, he's either going to be facing a fighter that is going to bring him some sort of challenge like an Artur Beterbiev, or if Canelo does lose again, this is my more than likely prediction. Of course, no one is 100% correct with their predictions. If I had to guess, by the time that Canelo Alvarez probably loses his next fight, he's probably going to be within that 36 to 38 year range. Who knows? He may he may continue boxing and he may only fight for a few more years and all in all, just decide to call it quits then. He may, unify another division or, he may get a couple more fights or who knows, maybe he'll go up to cruiserweight and fight someone there and then he'll say, you know what? I'm good. I'm done. I pretty much proved everything that I needed to prove. I don't want to suffer any damage and I don't want to get my ass whooped like some of these other older boxers did, like Manny Pacquiao did against Ugas or Sugar Ray Leonard did against Hector Macho Camacho. So,
Andre Ward retired so early, man. Andre Ward was somebody who was very, very disciplined to this, very devoted to the sport, very disciplined, and it was the wear and tear that he had, keeping his body in shape. That over time, man, he was just like, look, I can't keep it up, and I don't think Canelo Alvarez is going to be very far off from that, considering all the things that he's done in boxing. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section, and with that, I'm out. Peace.
Anyways, that's pretty much about it for this conversation. I just thought that it would be very, very interesting. Reason being is because it was just kind of a new conversation, kind of talk about Canelo. I've been talking a lot about where I rank him in history and all this sort of stuff, but I thought that this was interesting because I really had not heard anyone else really bring this up. Once again, do I believe that Canelo Alvarez is going to break down soon? You never know. Fannon, all in all, he did bring up the point of Canelo has been fighting, especially at a high level for a decently long time, and he's been fighting pretty much ever since he's been about 13, 15 years old. But do I believe all in all that he's just going to, combust out of nowhere, especially within the next couple of years? No, I don't. Because I think Canelo, I think that he's at his absolute peak. I think that you can tell when a fighter is at their absolute peak. And when I take a look at Canelo Alvarez, I'm not going to say that he looks unstoppable. But what I will say is this. If a fighter is going to beat him, it's gonna take every ounce of energy in their body that they have. It's gonna take a hell of an effort. They're gonna have to go all the way from heaven to hell to beat Canelo Alvarez because he's on that level overall to where all the other all-time great boxers were. I'm not going to quite put him on the same level as say like a prime Mayweather or maybe even a prime Pacquiao as of yet, but he's kind of on that level right now to where you take a look at him and within a multitude of weight divisions, it's like, wow, who really is going to defeat this guy definitively unless they're a clear A-plus boxer, like another equal competitor. Canelo is just one of those guys to where, like I said, just like Floyd Mayweather Jr., just like Manny Pacquiao, or Sugar Ray Leonard, or Marvin Hagler, or, Rocky Marciano, or whoever the hell you want to put out there. There's just not a lot of, adversaries for them. There's not a lot of people overall who are on their level. There's almost no one out there, in my opinion, who's on Canelo Alvarez's level. And I believe that there's a possibility that we may see a super fight between Canelo Alvarez and Errol Spence Jr. That's if Errol Spence Jr., if he's even undefeated to that point. But we'll see what happens all in all. And I believe personally that Canelo, he probably would stop Errol Spence Jr. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.